Good afternoon from Oxford, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's Executive MBA Taster session. Discover new approaches to strategy work with SBS Professor Eero Vaara. My name is Alejandra de Rojas, and I have been working at Saïd Business School for over 6 years now, and I'm part of the Executive MBA recruitment team, helping candidates from all over the world to successfully apply to Oxford to enrich their minds, enhance their careers. In today's session, you will see a glimpse into how our world-class faculty deliver on showcasing cutting-edge research, offering perspectives with lessons that really resonate with today's leaders and decision makers. So before I just pass it over to Professor Eero Vaara, let me share some information about our Oxford Executive MBA. Next slide, please. The Executive MBA at Oxford is very broad. It's diverse and stimulating. The teaching is highly interactive. It's taught in a modular format. It allows senior executives to be able to balance work, study, and any personal commitments while studying for a full master's degree. As you can see, over those approximately 2 years, you would have 14 to 16 week-long modules. The modules are typically taking place from Monday to Friday. You would come for your module at Oxford, and then you would go back home for about 4 to 6 weeks before you then come back to Oxford for your next module. And in between, you would have time for preparation work and probably meet with your group and fellow classmates. The first module is online, and then you have 2 core international modules that take place overseas, as well as some optional electives that can take place internationally too. And you can see some examples here on the slide. In terms of the cohorts, we have 2 cohorts per year. The next is in September, and the class size is usually around 65 to 70 students to expand your global network and build very close relationships with your former classmates. Over the 2 years, you have 11 core subjects like accounting, business finance, leadership, etc., and you have 1 core project, the entrepreneurship project. It's a really good way to either explore or develop your entrepreneurial side, or if you're just interested in learning more entrepreneurial skills that you could apply within your organization. It's very practical, and a number of these projects have been actually launched in the real world. And then you will have your 4 electives. Here is a way for you to tailor your masters depending on your interest. Some of these electives are joint ones with other cohorts to keep on expanding your networking possibilities. Next slide, please. Here you can see a snapshot of our January 2025 class, where we have 38 different nationalities represented, 33 different industry sectors, and with the final class having 38% female representation. We're looking for diversity, and it is also very much reflected in the values of the business school. Students get to surround themselves with over 60 of the brightest minds with most diverse experiences from all over the world. Next slide, please. And then finally, just to say, if you're considering applying for our next cohort in September, the next deadline is going to be on the 17th of March, and the final deadline will be on the 1st of July. Next slide, please. We have recently opened the application portal for the January 2026 intake, so there's still plenty of time for you to apply for any of these intakes. We do advise applying earlier rather than later, and this is just because there will be more places available to organize yourself, the funding, fully prepare and start getting the most from the program. Next slide, please. In terms of what's next, if you're considering applying to the Executive MBA program, we would love to hear more from you. So whether that would be submitting a CV review, or you could also book a call with one of us. We are spread by regions, and you're more than welcome to get in contact with us. Please use the QR codes to find out more information. Next slide, please. And just briefly, just letting you know about the upcoming sessions. We would love to see you on Thursday, the 27th of February in London, when we will be hosting a conversation with some of our alumni about their experiences of the program. And you will be given the chance to speak with our current students, alumni, the recruitment team, and also do a follow-up with us, nice evening with drinks and panel-based. On the 4th of March, you can join our admissions team online. We will be sharing more details on how you can submit a strong application. In order for you to register for these events, please use the QR codes provided on the slide. Otherwise, please use our website to find out more about the upcoming sessions. Next slide, please. And so, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Professor Eero Vaara, who will be leading today's session. Eero, amongst other hats that he wears, is a professor in organizations and impact at the Saïd Business School. Eero is the academic director on the DPhil in Management program and teaches on a number of postgraduate and executive programs, including the Executive MBA. Eero's research focuses on strategic and institutional change. So now I will pass it over to you, Eero.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, and good afternoon to you all, and welcome to this taster session, everyone. I'm feeling really excited for this opportunity to say something about new approaches to strategy work, and it's really a great pleasure to have this chance to see how far we can get with a taster session. I'm struggling a little bit to get my slides shared, but I think it's coming up now, right? So it's working. So I'm feeling very happy today, at least because of three reasons. The first reason is that, yeah, as Alejandra was explaining, it's a great program. The EMBA program, it's a great program, and I've had the pleasure and privilege to be part of that for, well, soon 6 years. And I've only really good things to say about that program. So that's number one. The second reason for feeling really happy is the topic of today. I cannot really think about anything more important than strategy work and thinking about what strategy work entails, especially considering what's going on in the world. You know, the world is crazy, and strategic leadership is definitely needed. But there's more to this, and this is really a key argument for this taster session. It so is that the more conventional or traditional approaches to strategy work have proven to be inadequate, really, to deal with today's challenges, not to speak about those of the future. And I think most of us have seen this firsthand in the past, let's say, 10, 15 years, at the latest, I guess, after the financial crisis. When seeing the world go through turmoil, you know, we can talk about COVID, or we can talk about war in Ukraine or other things, and of course all the other developments also on the positive side, for instance, in terms of what AI is doing to many industry sectors and how it's impacting companies and other organizations. So the thing is that the traditional approaches, which usually are starting from the idea that it's a top-down activity when we're talking about strategy work, oftentimes called strategic planning, are met with these demands, which would be better met with a new thinking and new approaches, which would be able to engage people and also help to be more agile when we are amidst of institutional and strategic change. I'm also really happy because this topic is, of course, close to my heart. Alejandro was mentioning, so I've been doing a lot of research on strategic change and institutional change, and definitely working on strategy and in particular strategy work. And if I wasn't providing this taster session, I should actually be working on my new book for the Oxford University Press on new approaches to strategy work. So actually, this is a distraction. I should be working on the book. But anyway, I really appreciate this chance. A third reason to feel really happy is really, participation here. What a big number of people you guys are, and there's a part of me wishing that we would be here in Oxford at Saïd Business School in person, so that we could have interaction face to face. But hey, this is the second best thing, and actually it works pretty well, and we'll be trying to make this interactive as well, with a couple of polls coming up. And I really encourage you to also ask questions through chat or otherwise, and we'll try to tackle them in part during the presentation part, and I'll definitely make sure that we have some time at the end of this to tackle some of the key questions. Okay, so what are we here for? So we are here for a taster session, but this is an important session, and I really want us to rethink what strategy work is all about. So I'm going to argue that as I was briefly mentioning, that the traditional approaches to strategy work are simply inadequate in terms of dealing with the challenges that companies and organizations are facing. So we need new approaches. We need new approaches both in terms of being able to conceptualize what strategy work is all about differently, and not to speak. And perhaps more importantly, we also need that to be able to then orchestrate or lead strategy work in new ways. And in this session, I'm going to be mentioning two such approaches: open strategy, which is in a way a radical departure from the more conventional approaches. It's almost like a 180-degree departure, in the sense that the idea is that participation in strategy work is not restricted, but the idea is to open it up as much as possible. Now, how much opening up is needed, that depends, of course, on the case and context in question. The second approach that I'm going to mention, at least, and let's see how much time we have for that, is living strategy, which then means that instead of thinking that there's planning and then it takes some time to implement the strategies, strategy work would be an ongoing dialogue and sense-making process. More about that in a moment. I'm also going to briefly mention two case examples. The first one is Wikimedia, that I know pretty well. I've been involved in Wikimedia's strategy work. So that's the example for open strategy. And then Google Play is the example for living strategy. Okay, so what's the game plan? I'll start off with a definition of strategy work. We'll soon have the first poll to make sure that you guys are awake and focused and thinking about these things. And then we'll spend a little bit of time in terms of contextualizing what this new strategy work that I would be calling strategy work 4.0 is all about. And that will then move us to these two new approaches: open strategy first, living strategy next. Okay, so let's get started. So we are in Oxford, and a good idea always is to be clear about what we're talking about. So definitions sounds boring, but it's actually really important when we're trying to rethink what strategy work is all about. So the way I'm thinking about strategy work, and you're welcome to have a different perspective, but the way I'm thinking is that there are all kinds of issues. Issues are like problems or challenges or opportunities and threats around us. And in the best of cases, we're able to address those challenges, make sense of the challenges. And this is what strategy work is all about. So we used to call it strategic planning, but the problem is that has some connotations that are limiting our understanding of strategy work. So the way I'm defining strategy work is that it involves the formation of strategic ideas as well as enactment of those ideas as strategies in organizations. Sounds complicated, but I would like us to focus on the notion of work. So this, I think, is a very fruitful perspective. It's a fruitful conceptualization because work means that it doesn't happen by itself, right? strategies don't, just emerge or come into fruition without, someone working on these processes and someone also orchestrating and leading strategy work. Also, I think that the term work has the benefit that it makes us perhaps have more realistic views and assumptions of what it means. Meaning that sometimes we are thinking that, strategies are like need to be perfect, or that, if we haven't got it right, it's all going to be ending in a catastrophe. I think work is a good term because it means that, the more we invest in this work, the more likely is that we will have a good outcome. I'll be speaking about those themes a little bit more in a moment. But these are the challenges for us for this session, and also more generally as to how to rethink what strategy work is all about, and then try to have some examples as to what that could mean for a particular company and organization. But I want to also emphasize that there is no one approach that would tick all boxes. Depending on where you are with your company or an organization, it may be that open strategy is the new thing, or its application in a particular part of your organization will help to advance strategy work and to deal with the big issues that are important. It may also be that that's not the approach to be taken, but it might be something else. For instance, this idea of moving to a more towards a living strategy approach, meaning that it would be ongoing strategic sense making. So that's all I have to say for starters, but now it's your turn. So let's move to the first poll. So what we've done, Alejandra and Lucky and me, we've constructed this pretty simple poll. So I would ask you to go to menti.com, and I know that some of you have done this a zillion times, and I know that some of you might not have done it before. It's very easy. Go to menti.com and use this code, or alternatively, you can also scan this QR code, and that will lead you to menti.com. And then, then you will see a few questions emerge, and these are the kinds of, when you're getting to the questions, these are the kinds of things that people usually are thinking about when they are reflecting upon what's really difficult in a strategy work. And I really encourage you to answer this from your own perspective, knowing that they may all be important, but please don't just, tick 5 for all of those, but let us have a little bit of distribution. And I'm actually really, really curious to see as to what it looks like in terms of the results that are going to be emerging on our screen in any moment. And that's, I think, Lucky, your job. So let's see. Let's see what's happening as we are speaking. So, wow. Okay. It's a living beast. You're still responding. No panic mode. If you haven't yet finished, please just, take your time. But I'll start making some sense out of these results. First of all, it seems to me that we are soon able to call the winner, right? The winner is implementation. Right. It might change still a little bit, but that's, 4.7. That's pretty much as, as high as it gets. And to be honest, this is not surprising, because people like me who are doing a lot of research on this topic and who are engaging with a number of companies and organizations, out of many studies and surveys, this is what's emerging most of the time, that people have really realized that it's not really the planning side, if we define that in the more narrow sense, that it's the biggest challenge, but it's more how to be able to implement or enact those strategic ideas. And that's one key reason, or perhaps the key reason, for why we need new approaches. And let me see, participation and engagement, I think it's going to be second. So that's silver. Silver medal goes to participation and engagement. And that also, as it happens, fits with today's storyline really well, because it's easy to call for more engagement on the part of organizational members, but it's actually surprisingly difficult to make people across sometimes big and complex organizations to meaningfully participate in a strategy process. So what to do about that? The first example of a new approach, open strategy, it's really all about participation and engagement. And then I'm really glad also that it's thinking outside the box, creativity, which is going to take the third place, I think, unless there's a dramatic shift somewhere. And that's probably one of the absolutely key challenges in strategy work. And it has been like that for a really long time. And to me, as a person, as a person who's studying these processes and a facilitator and consultant in many cases, I think this is the thing that we really want to have, which is use the opportunities in strategy work sessions or processes to figure out how we could do things differently to be able to be even more successful in the past. And agility, idea generation, they're not doing badly, but they are not the winners here. So as you probably also figured out by now, these are all reasons for why we need the new approaches. But definitely implementation is the key. Okay, let's move forward. So we will go back to me sharing. I probably have to start slide sharing again. And there we are. I think we're good. So let's then try to put where we are today in context. I wish we had like a week. I wish it was already one of the modules and you would be here in Oxford and we would be enjoying Oxford, but also having time to reflect upon strategy work and its evolution. We are not going to do that now, maybe in the future, I hope so, but let me just try to do the impossible, which is to, instead of using 2 days for this, I'm just going to take 2 minutes on this, right? Okay, so to know where we are and to understand the future challenges is oftentimes good to go back in time and see how things have developed over time. And it's really hard to say when strategy work really got going. And you could argue that it was a couple of thousand years ago. Maybe it was the ancient Chinese philosophers or statespersons. Maybe it was where the ancient Greek, where the term strategy comes from. Maybe it's military strategy. All of those would be, origins for organizing and strategizing. But to narrow it down a little bit, the thing that we nowadays mostly think about in terms of strategic planning or strategy work really got going after the Second World War. And people like me who have been studying these processes also from a historical perspective, we've been able to see the evolution such that after the Second World War, when companies were growing and internationalizing, especially those in the US, created this need to be more, more focused in terms of what kinds of strategic moves to take. And what I've been calling 1.0 is the mode where it was mostly individual actors strategizing with the members in their top management teams, for instance. But then when companies were growing and becoming more complex and industries were developing and technological development really got going in the 1950s, this led to a need to be more systematic in strategic planning. And we can talk about a golden era in strategic planning in the 1960s when many of, well, at least some of the, big consulting companies that we know got going, and where also strategy as a discipline got going or started to become a big thing, especially on the East Coast in the US, but soon after also in other places, for instance, here in the UK. And in many ways, the practices of strategic planning are still there with us. They have developed over time, but many of the key ideas in terms of being systematic in planning and trying to figure out the biggest challenges and there to develop best possible responses, stay with us. But there are features which, of course, from today's perspective, don't feel that beneficial. For instance, when we've been studying, strategic planning in the late 1960s, it wasn't an uncommon practice to see this as really important, very secretive and confidential activity, such that big companies would have only a few copies of the key documents. They would stamp them top secret and put them into the company safe, as in James Bond style. Well, we know that, yeah, that was great in terms of keeping things confidential, but not so good in terms of making things happen. Hence, implementation, going back to our poll. So what we have seen, and we are all part of this, right? We've all seen this happening at the latest, in the latter part of the 1970s, we've seen this increasing development where more engagement and participation has been called for. And of course, in the past, 10, 20 years even, of course, communication technology has provided us means to help to reach out to, different stakeholders, even if we're not in the same physical place. And in a way, we could stop here. We could stop here and say that this is the trend that's, going on. But that would be wrong. And that would be too easy, because I'm absolutely convinced that what's happening in the past 10, 15 years has created a new rupture, in the sense that with the changes in our institutional environments, it's not only that increasing engagement and participation is called for, but also agility, ability to react, in the best of cases, proactively react, although that sounds like an oxymoron, to those changes. And that's hard. It's really hard, for instance, to engage a number of people in a systematic planning process that oftentimes takes time, and at the same time be able to, move ahead with strategic changes if they are called for. Just think about COVID time, for instance. And there's more. There's more, of course, also on the side of opportunities. We know that technological development, especially AI, is also, changing the landscape and the ways in which we can engage in strategy work. So that's what I would call strategy work 4.0. And the question mark there is a real question. It's a real question mark for people like me who are studying these processes and trying to figure out what this new form of strategy work is all about. But it's also a question mark, I would say, for most organizations who are facing these challenges and have to figure out themselves as to which kinds of approaches to follow to be able to deal with the strategic challenges that they are facing. And I would say it's also a question mark for us in this session to figure out how we would, as individuals, make sense of the best ways to address those challenges. I think there's some questions there. Alejandra, shall we take, at least there's one that I'm seeing from Nurul.
Yes, Nurul, if you're so kind, please, do you mind typing the question on the Q&A box? And then we will be happy to answer. In the meantime, I believe that we can continue. Eero.
Yes, thanks so much. I just want to make sure that if you have questions, we will be addressing those. And I'm not able to see all those questions on the screen that I have here. Okay, so the argument is that we've reached a point where there's a new mode of strategy work that is forming, which we can call 4.0. It doesn't mean that 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 would be disappearing, but it means that there are like new practices of strategy work that are needed to address the challenges we're facing. And although I'm just arguing that there's no one approach that can tick all boxes, I do want to just elaborate a little bit to explain what this 4.0 seems to look like. And in my view, it's clearly different from the past in the sense that it's more based on engagement and distributed leadership. So it's less of, top-down approach, or it's less reliant on individual persons as leaders who could, completely pull it off. And I think we can understand this from the point of view of the difficulties in implementation, for instance. That was the key, the winner in our poll. It's also ongoing in a different way than, what planning used to be. There are traditions of like 5-year planning or plans that are made every other year, depending on the organizational and industrial context. Whereas it seems that 4.0 is calling oftentimes for a more continuous, ongoing basis for strategy work. And what's also happening is that people are realizing that, especially in bigger or complex organizations, it's not enough that there's this overall strategy process at the top, but we also need continuous strategy work in different parts of organizations, which also, creates its challenges, right? In terms of, hopefully making sure that these different processes of strategy work would be in sync. So there are opportunities, and the new approaches are needed for good reasons, but they also come with challenges. And I was already briefly mentioning that one of the key dilemmas is this, involving more and more people while, maintaining this agility or ability to deal with the strategic issues as they come. That's hard because the former usually takes a lot of time and planning, and the latter requires swift action. So not easy. Second question or challenge, how to deal with, different and conflicting views. We know that this is always difficult, but if we are engaging bigger and bigger numbers of people, of course, you are likely to face even more, differences of opinion and of course, outright resistance as well. Always in strategy work, creation of shared understanding is difficult, but it's even more difficult if the process is less top-down and less controlled as they used to be in the past. So how to make sure that there is shared understanding and how to communicate this to different parts of the organization, not an easy challenge. And I would finish off this slide by emphasizing the biggest overall challenge of them all, which is how to then be able to orchestrate such distributed strategy work. And that's the real challenge. Okay, Alejandra, over to you.
Sorry to interrupt you, Eero. We have some questions now on the Q&A box. For example, are you able to read them? Otherwise, I'm happy to read them for you. From Saïd Selman. Greetings from Dubai. Hello, greetings from Oxford. He has some questions for you. Do you want to read them, Eero, or I can do it for you?
Can you do it for me? For some reason, I don't see them while I'm screen sharing here.
No worries. So Saïd wants to know, is there a risk that a consensual strategy formulation approach, which it sounds like to me, dilutes the strategic direction and could make the future direction less clear?
What a great question. Thank you for this first question, which is totally hitting the nail. This is one of the challenges. If we are trying to engage a lot of people and reach a consensus, what oftentimes happens is that the consensus is somewhere in the middle, or that there's indeed dilution in the sense that what we are coming up is like a relatively high level or an abstract strategy which has less ability to really help people to move forward. So that's a real challenge. And of course, skillful orchestration of the strategy process should take this into account so that one wouldn't fall into this pitfall of, for instance, trying to create consensus on things that are where compromise is not helpful, or not shying away from taking a stance or taking additional steps on top of a consensus to have a sharper and more directive strategy being formulated.
Thank you, Eero. We have another question from Arlene. He's interested in open strategy work and how you organize the right resources to be available at the right time to ensure timely implementation. In other words, how do we prioritize limited central resources and capital when the model is more federated?
Yeah, again, a great question. And I try to be a person, I usually try to be open and honest about all things. So dealing with or leading the new approaches is not at all easy. It's actually more difficult than the more conventional approaches. And we should be mindful about the dilemmas that are involved. And these are the real questions. And I don't have a universal answer to these questions in terms of, for instance, limited resources. Maybe the situation may be different depending on the organization or the company, or maybe different in terms of the urgency of change. But I'll tell you this, the orchestration of strategy processes will always mean difficult calls and choices in terms of how to do this. What helps? I'll just mention two things. One is time, looking at it as a process. So not everything needs to be done at once. This is also a partial response to the first question. I wouldn't like us to see strategy work as if it was simply a town hall meeting where we vote, and that's the result. But I would think about it as a process where we move from one meeting, one workshop, one activity to another. The other one is managing expectations. That's really important. So if people who are really eager to participate, if they have a false assumption that everything they say would be included in the final strategy document, then that's going to fail. But if it's skillfully managed such that people understand that, for instance, in this first poll, we are gathering insights on the basis of which we will distill some of the key themes, and then there will be further moments and opportunities to engage with particular topics, then people are usually much better off. Okay, shall we move forward? I know that there are more questions, and I trust that you, Alejandra, you are on top of things. So we'll get to those. But I want to move forward so that we can have a more concrete sense of what these two approaches, open strategy and living strategy, can be all about. So open strategy basically means focus on participation. But to help us all focus on participation, let's do another poll. So let's move on to the other poll. You'll see the Menti code and the well, it's the same drill basically. Go to menti.com and or use the QR code and you'll get to the right page. So let's think about participation, and this because open strategy is all about participation. And this time the poll was a little bit more difficult. and you can kind of see my twisted mind behind that. So not all of the questions are like totally straightforward. But again, the main thing is to make you guys think about participation, but from this point of view that, you know, there are questions and challenges and dilemmas involved. So let's see. It seems that we have winners in the sense that there's this dynamic duo, depends because it's tricky, and then that the practices must depend on the cultural and institutional context are the winners. And this is, to use the metaphor, music to my ears, because this is indeed one of the key learning points. And I can also see now some of the questions in the chat and the really good points made by you guys, in the sense that it's very different if you are, for instance, in a startup organization versus like a big multinational company. That's true. And so also when we're orchestrating participation, the challenges as well as the solutions to those challenges would be different. I'm also very happy that the latter two, strategy is all about control, which would be strategy work 1.0, if you recall the slide a moment ago where I showed the evolution of strategy work is winning. I'm also very happy that I don't get it is not winning either, because otherwise we would be in big trouble. So I trust that this means that we're on the same page, in the sense that, you know, orchestrating participation would depend on the context. So let's just move forward to open strategy, or back to open strategy. So back to my slide set. Okay. Open strategy, following the poll, is all about participation. There's another aspect which ties with participation that is oftentimes, you know, seen as the other defining characteristic, and that's transparency. So that it's not only that people get to participate, but it's as open as possible, so that people would also transparently see what's being developed, and they would be able to, you know, therefore better engage in those processes. So I'm not going to spend all of our time on the slides that I've prepared, but I just want to say that this is a really cool new approach that is getting more and more traction. And it started with organizations such as social movement organizations, but it's becoming increasingly popular among all kinds of organizations and companies. And the case example that I'm going to zoom in on is Wikimedia, partly because I honestly think that it's probably the best example we have in the world for this, and secondly, because I've been involved in that process. So what does open strategy mean? It's like a revolution, in the sense that we will probably never get there. Like, it's never going to be like, you know, fully open, that everyone, regardless of your position or where you are in the organization, that you could participate in strategy work on an equal basis as those who would be, for instance, the top people. But that's the idea, that the opening up, including more and more stakeholders, not only internally but externally. And why? Precisely to be able to deal with the challenges that we started the whole session with, in terms of having more insights from a number of perspectives, and also meeting the expectations of people who want to be involved. Okay, so I'm a big believer in open strategy, not though from the perspective that this would fit all organizations or all purposes, not at all. And also, I've been a little bit frustrated myself with the label, which kind of, play with words, leaves it very open. So actually, with some colleagues, we've worked on this, and I've myself used this categorization that it can be, open strategy can be applied in a more limited sense as part of a more traditional strategy process. So there's a part of the process where, you know, inputs, for instance, are solicited from a number of people within and sometimes outside the organization. But it can also be, and that's the second mode, closer to the ideal in the sense that it's actually allowing people to co-create strategies in a way that it's not controlled from the top. And in the best of cases, so to speak, and this would be the ideal setting, it would also mean what we are calling deep engagement, meaning that when people are involved in the process, they can also have an impact on the process itself. And if there's any example that comes close to the ideal of deep engagement, that would be Wikimedia. Before jumping to Wikimedia, let me just briefly point out, and that's really in the spirit of your questions as well, that it's not going to be easy. Orchestrating an open strategy process, especially in an organization that hasn't done this before, is extremely difficult. And therefore, you might want to try with the more limited participation, more limited open strategy application in the beginning. And then people like us, for me, and my colleagues here who have been involved in these processes and studying these processes, we've come up with a whole list of challenges that are the details of which I will skip here. And by the way, you'll get the slides if you want, after this session, as well as a recording from this session. And I should also advertise that anyone who wants to be in touch with me, you please just email and we can continue the conversation also after this session. But there are all kinds of dilemmas, and the way in which they are or can be dealt with would surely depend on the case at hand. But finally, Wikimedia. So why Wikimedia? Well, first of all, it's a very unique organization. This is the umbrella organization behind Wikipedia. So we kind of know Wikipedia, but it's called Wikimedia. That's the organization, the services and products of which most of us are using almost on a daily basis. But it's also like a hugely interesting organization in the sense that it's really relying. It's largely a bunch of volunteers, thousands and tens of thousands of people who are involved in this movement. So therefore, it's not surprising that when it comes to strategizing, the idea that it would be a small group of people deciding on the strategies doesn't work. And it didn't work in the past. So therefore, around 2015, 16, and later on in 2017, they really wanted to do it differently. And they launched this process, which was a really extensive, a long process as well, trying to reach out to different stakeholders in different parts of the world, having more, traditional workshops and face-to-face meetings, as well as towards the end of the process, more and more online meetings as well, allowing people to really engage in this strategy process. I'll skip the details, partly because you can read about that. You can get access to this case you just Google Wikimedia strategy playbook. That's a playbook we developed on the basis of these experiences. And it's openly available. That kind of goes with the spirit of Wikimedia as well as, of course, open strategy. So what emerged out of this process was an idea of 10 key cornerstones of their strategy. But it's not only that these would be like labels or things that we should be striving at, but there would be a lot of content in each of those 10 areas. But the playbook is about how to orchestrate open strategy work. So it's really a good resource if you are interested in this. And unfortunately, we don't have more time in this session to go into the details, but I'll just mention that when you go on Google and open the more than 100-page long document, you'll be seeing these themes of how to plan an open strategy process, how to invest in collaboration, how to deal with communication that is not one-way communication that goes to all directions, and how to, most importantly of all, how to really make sure that there's participation, which means not only like calling for participation or inviting people to participate in meetings, but all kinds of other practices, trying to make sure that people who are coming from different areas, have different kinds of backgrounds, have different kinds of expectations, would be able to be part of the process, and in the best of cases, on their own terms. Meaning that some people are experts in particular areas, some people are very much already involved in the core activities of Wikimedia, and some are more peripheral actors. And I think what was really cool with this process is that it wasn't such that there would be like this one town hall meeting and a vote, but it would be a long process involving all kinds of activities geared towards getting the most out of all people who wanted to participate. So as you can hear, I'm super excited about this case, but when you will read about the case, you will also see that the playbook is written in a way which I'm actually proud of, because it really also contains the challenges, and it talks about the successes, but also the failures in this process. And in that sense, I think it's a really good resource for anyone who becomes now an enthusiast in open strategy, or is otherwise interested in promoting participation in strategy work. Okay. Let me then move to living strategy, and we'll spend less time on this, but I think the idea is interesting. And I also want to hammer home the point that there's no one approach. As much as I'm an eager supporter of open strategy, I don't think that it works in all contexts, right? Another way of dealing with the challenges, and another way of responding to the question mark in terms of what strategy work 4.0 is all about, is living strategy. And here the basic idea is in some ways similar to open strategy, but in other ways very different. The idea is not that there would be an orchestration of a special process where different stakeholders would be invited to be part of. This instead would be something which is happening in the organization almost on a daily basis, based on key ideas of ongoing dialogue, as well as having both top-down corporate level strategy work and bottom-up autonomous strategy work in teams and units. The case that I've been collaborating with in recent years is Google Play. And this is not, again, meant as an advertisement that everything Google is great. And I'm sure that there are people from Google anyway here who would know better. But there's pros and cons. Also pros and cons with any of these models or approaches to strategy work, right? But I think it's a great case example which shows that inbuilt in Google Play is this idea that there's this corporate level or top-down strategy work that helps to provide the framework, helps to create the big picture, of course, also based on the feedback that they get bottom-up. But even more importantly, there's this autonomous strategy work in teams and units, which is sometimes in sync with the corporate level strategy work, and sometimes not so much in sync, but nevertheless super important, because of course, especially in a big tech company like Google, you need these new ideas. You need new innovations. You need ways in which you can do things differently. Otherwise, Google would lose its edge, right? So we can see that this is an example of something where it's kind of natural that a system like this would work. But I'm also of the view that in some ways, the same thing can also be useful in other organizations, even in organizations such as universities, which are notorious, well, let me put it this way, very difficult in terms of, being successfully managed top down. Well, whereas as we're trying to do in Oxford, where we're trying to do it differently in terms of making sure that there's a lot of autonomy and that the top down and bottom up processes, as well as those across different units, would be providing a basis for an ongoing dialogue. Well, I'm not going to say anything more about that, except that in such living strategy approach, it's not only the more formal practices, but also the informal practices that play a key role. And I'll just finish off by mentioning two things. well, it's kind of one thing in Google, which I've always thought really cool. Thank God it's Friday. TGIF. Well, it's not Friday today. It's actually Thursday, which nicely fits with this example. Because in Google, it used to be such that there was a weekly or bi-weekly meeting in the main campus in Mountain View, where the key people or some of the key people from top management, oftentimes the co-founders, would be explaining what's going on in terms of new strategic ideas and initiatives and where the company's moving towards. But when this is how the story goes, when they got a little bit older and got some family, they wanted to move this from Friday night to Thursday. So thank God it's Friday is actually on Thursday in Google. And it's not only happening in Mountain View, but for a long time it's been streamed all over the world. So that's a cool practice, which is in part formal, but it's in part very informal also. But there's this cool thing called Google Meme Gen that was created initially as a way of tongue-in-cheek being able to make fun of what the key people, what the top managers were telling in these meetings. But it has thereafter become an institutionalized part of what's going on. So you have the presentations and discussions taking place, but you also have this sideshow where people are sharing their thoughts and memes and sometimes very critical ideas as well in terms of what's going on and stances taken to support or resist or provide alternative views on the strategic ideas and initiatives. So as you can hear, there's so much more to be said about these different practices, but I realize that the time is up in the sense that I will stop here. Just as a way of recapping, I just want to say that I'm a firm believer that the world has changed and we need these new approaches. What they are, that's a real question that we each one have to, figure out differently, depending on where we are and what we are responsible for, what we are aiming at. Two approaches I found particularly interesting and appealing because they are very different from the traditional ways of thinking about strategy work. Number one, open strategy, where the idea is not so that it's restricted to a selected few or top down, but it's almost the opposite, allowing as many stakeholders as possible, now depending on the circumstances, to be part of the process. And the living strategy, where it's not so that there would be like periods of planning followed by implementation, but it would be an ongoing activity of strategy, generation, and adaptation. So I'll stop here, but we have some time for the questions. And do you want to, Alejandra, again, help me in terms of seeing what we have already talked about and what not?
Absolutely. Thank you, Eero. So, for example, we pick up one from Carlos, based in Portugal. Hello, Carlos. He wants to know, is there evidence to show that open strategy leads to better outcomes in terms of implementation and better business outcomes?
What a great question. I was kind of expecting something like this, and I was afraid that something like this would come up as questions. The first part is easier to answer. We know from all kinds of analysis that engaging more people will ultimately improve the quality of the process, the quality of decision making, as well as the senses, of being including and heard in the organization. So that's happening. Then the impact on performance, however we measure that, that's a tricky one. That's a tricky one. And sometimes, as we know, you could have an organization with a really bad strategy process still doing great because of, a great business idea or product or service, or because it's a period of boom and big demand. And sometimes we could have organizations that are doing all they can brilliantly in terms of strategy work, but are not able to still do so well in a very competitive environment. I think there is some evidence that more engagement and participation does lead also to better business performance, but we shouldn't simplify that relationship either.
Brilliant. Thank you, Eero. Maybe we have time for a final question, if that's okay, Eero. Yeah, one question from Stefan from Peru. He is wondering, and this is a very interesting question, if you had to propose a name for Strategy 5.0, what would it be? For example, what's the big frontier in strategy?
God damn it. I thought 4.0 was already like a big leap from 3.0. But I know. And I think that there were some comments on AI previously. So I think that's it in terms of how artificial intelligence or its different manifestations are baked into this process. And it's in some ways it's not altogether different. For instance, what I've been really enthusiastic about is that although I'm a big believer in, real people interacting and we investing time in that, I think that's the best we can have. AI can help already at this point to, for instance, give voice to people or stakeholders, even non-human stakeholders in the strategy process. And that I find intriguing. So for instance, what that could be, well, future generations or people who haven't yet been born or nature. Such, actors can already be included if we're thinking about participation. And this on top of the obvious impact of AI, which is that we will be better able to collect information and condense and have like drafts of strategic ideas or new plans created much faster than ever before.
Brilliant. Thank you, Eero. Well, I think I'm conscious of time, so thank you so much for everyone who joined us today. That was brilliant, fascinating. I really hope that you enjoyed today's session. And Eero, thank you once again for taking the time to talk to us. Also, thank you to my colleague Lucky from the marketing team for his kind support today. And well, I'm wishing you all a nice day, and we hope we can keep in touch. If you want to find out more, please reach out to us. Thank you.
Well, thank you again. Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you, Lucky. Thank you, everyone. And if you feel that your questions were not responded or if you otherwise want to reach out, please just email and I'll be really happy to continue the conversation. Thanks so much.